Welcome to another episode of the SNA Speakeasy. Today we have a brother journalist, an investigative journalist. His name is Jake Adelstein. You've probably heard of him. Uh, Jake is going to also, like myself, follows Japanese politics very closely. And so we're going to have I think, a very intimate discussion about the current Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe. I think both myself and Jake are relatively well known as being not the biggest fans of the Prime Minister, but we try to analyze him as objectively as possible. Um, and this Prime Minister has been the historically longest Prime Minister in all of Japanese history. And now he seems to be towards the end of the road. But Jake, first of all, why don't you introduce yourself? Who are you, and how did you become a political analyst in Japan?
I'm Jake Adelstein. I've been a reporter here since 1993. I went to college here and I graduated and went to work for the very conservative Yomiuri Shimbun, which used to be a much better paper, or at least it was a better paper when I entered. Um, I spent 12 and a half years there, then worked on a project for the State Department for about 2 years, and went back to journalism. Um, and since 2011, I've been covering everything in Japan, including politics, social issues. Um, I got to see the Democratic Party of Japan lose power after a series of scandals, and watch Prime Minister Abe, who we all thought would never return to power, come back. And he has been wreaking havoc ever since. Really, it's been like 7 years of scandal after scandal, and you keep thinking that this guy would eventually lose power. But when you have no shame, it's kind of easy to stay on to power. I think that this is a prime minister who really understands that, as there's some Japanese saying about in 82 days, every rumor fades. If you can hold on to power long enough, people will forget, and you can stick around.
Well, short memories do seem to be part of the mix, to be sure. So I guess let's start with that. You're already starting to embark on it. Um, what would you say? I mean, if you were trying to be as cool and calm as you could about it, what would you say are the main accomplishments of Abe during his 8 years in power? And what would
Nothing. He's accomplished nothing.
well, isn't that a little extreme? I mean, hasn't he, for example, stimulated tourism through his economic policies, or provided a modicum of stability to the nation after prime ministers every year, that kind of stuff?
If chipping away at press freedom and making inequality between the sexes greater is an accomplishment, then he certainly accomplished that. He has, during his reign, Japan dropped from number 11 in world press freedom to number 64, 65 at the most recent one. The gender gap ranking for Japan has continued to go down during his reign. I think it's now 121 out of 153 countries. Um, People in their 40s have less savings than they've ever had. Economic inequality is at its highest ever. Half of all working mothers are in poverty. But the Japanese stock market looks good, so that's an accomplishment.
Okay, well, there's something. You said something nice about him. Well, there's already a minor success. All right. So, we are, as you've said, okay, well, why has he survived so long? You already started to embark on that. You sort of cited his shamelessness, but can you kind of get into that a little more? Why is it that
Well,
this guy and not other prime ministers has lasted this long?
Well, in one sense, he has benefited from the fact that there is no opposition party in Japan that to oppose him. Um, and there is no opposition within the Liberal Democratic Party as well to take him down. In some senses, Japan for years had the Liberal Democratic Party ruling it, decades and decades, until the Democratic Party of Japan actually won in 2009. Um, but one of the things that sort of made people okay with it is that there were various factions within the LDP, so that if one faction became too corrupt and too close to some industry, the other faction would bring them down. So in some ways, it was kind of a balance within the thing. But since Abe has taken power, he's sort of ruthlessly nullified all the other factions. So, they always talk about Abe Ikkyo, like, the one and only Abe, the all-powerful. And he has, with the aid of some very good advisors, including Kitamura, who is really sort of a Machiavellian figure that you don't hear much about, sort of Abe's own personal police force. He's managed to nullify the media, the bureaucracy, and the Liberal Democratic Party itself. So he's unopposed. So he can't be taken out of power. And the only other, I think the other opposition party that has substantial support is Constitutional Democratic Party of Japan, which has 6%. So with no regime change, with no alternatives, it's very hard to get rid of him. Even his own party is finding it hard to get rid of him, and they'll only do it when they think it might cost them in the next elections. And maybe if Komeito starts to get cold feet about Abe, they may sort of force him out of office. So he's lucky, right? He's lucky in the sense that in 2007, Abe had a disastrous year as prime minister, mired by scandal and cronyism, just like he is now. And during his years in the wilderness, he sort of saw the light with this Shinto cult that's closely tied to the LDP called Nippon Kaigi. And Nippon Kaigi has a hardcore following of disgruntled old people and Shinto believers through the world that helped propel him back into power in 2012. And what happened in 2012 is, is that there had been a nuclear disaster. People weren't very happy with the way that the Democratic Party of Japan had run things. They had a general election. The LDP won by a huge landslide, and then the Democratic Party of Japan fell apart. And so basically, there's been no alternative to Abe. There's been no alternative to the LDP. So when there's no alternative, people just put up with him. And the other thing that he's done, which was really brilliant, in 2014, he created, just because apparently you can just do this, the Cabinet Personnel Bureau. And you think, like, so what? So he created a Cabinet Personnel Bureau. Like, what is the significance of that? The significance of that is, powers for the taking. And when Abe set up the Cabinet Personnel Bureau, it basically gives him and his cabinet control over about 600 to 700 top bureaucrat positions. Top bureaucrats in the Ministry of Justice, in the prosecutor's office, in the Ministry of Finance. And what that means is that every single bureaucrat in Japan, including the prosecutors and people in the Ministry of Justice, know that if they oppose Abe, if they don't do what he wants, if they don't read the air, so to speak, and make him happy, that they won't advance up in the bureaucratic ladder. And that threat of non-promotion, of being sidelined, has allowed him to really control the bureaucracy. I mean, it's kind of a brilliant move. And that is one way he's consolidated power. If you look at the last few years of scandals involving Liberal Democratic Party members, including former Prime Minister Obuchi's daughter, Amari, who was one of Abe's close personal cronies, Shimomura, who was his, I'm dropping the sans there, so forgive me, people. Of course, I really respect Shimomura, former education minister. But all these people mired in scandals, and every time that the prosecutors should have prosecuted them, including the incredible forgery of documents involved in the Moritomo Gakuen scandal, they've punted. They haven't done anything. So if the prosecutors allow malfeasance to go unpunished, and bureaucrats are rewarded for loyalty by promotion, and the bureaucrats that do speak out or kill themselves because they don't want to do something illegal aren't treated as heroes, and the whole system falls apart. Abe's created this perfect system where no good deed goes unpunished, and those who enable him to get away with breaking the law or benefiting his cronies are rewarded. and thus you really can't get rid of him. I mean, he's so entrenched in the system, and there's so many people who want to see him stay in power because it benefits them, that we're stuck with him. He's just lost so much popularity with the general public that his own party is beginning to think that maybe it's time for him to go.
All right. Well, you mentioned there that the official opposition parties kind of fell apart on their own and haven't been able to get up off the floor in all of these years. And you also mentioned that the Cabinet Personnel Bureau, and this is the means by which he's been able to intimidate and control the bureaucracy. But, as you mentioned earlier on, one of the major checks and balances historically on Japanese prime ministers was, powerful rivals within the Liberal Democratic Party who would jump on, the mistakes that were made. And certainly Abe has made such big enough mistakes that past prime ministers would have been taken out by one of their rivals by now. And Abe certainly does have rivals within the ruling party, the most prominent probably being Shigeru Ishiba. So why have these sort of rebels within the ruling party or alternative prime ministers not been able to emerge in all of these years?
Because, generally speaking, the sort of dirty politics that happen in the LDP is when you have rivals and they want to get rid of the current prime ministers, they get the prosecutors to move on them and find some sort of criminal malfeasance that they've done. And the prosecutors are basically the crowbar in which you get a prime minister to resign. Often the prosecutors would, sort of look the other way if you took what they call shakai seisai, social responsibility or social discipline, and resigned from your position. So, there's nobody better taking down a prime minister, an LDP prime minister, than the LDP itself. But Abe is so powerful, and even Ishiba Shigeru-san is a smart, shrewd politician, but he doesn't have enough support and enough popularity to get rid of Abe. And Abe is really good at sort of whining and dining people and getting them to side with him. If you oppose him, he's ruthless about making your life hard. If you support him, he's very good to his cronies. If you want to say something positive about Shinzo Abe, is that in general, people who have loyal to him, who have done favors for him, he never forgets. The problem with that kind of cronyism is that you see places like Dentsu and Pasona getting almost $1 billion of government contracts for not doing any work. But that's Abe rewarding his buddies who have been loyal to him, who have been advisor to him. Takanaka Heizo, who's now the chairman of Pasona. I mean, he's been a great political friend to Abe, and almost all of Abe's labor reforms have benefited Pasona, which is one of Japan's biggest labor dispatch companies. So, that's also a problem with Shinzo Abe, is that all his policies are for the benefit of his buddies rather than the nation itself. Almost all of them.
Okay, well, if we had this talk 2 years ago, everything we've said so far would have applied quite equally, I think. But why suddenly here in 2020 are we seeing things begin to unravel for Abe? Why is he now clearly a much weaker prime minister than he was a few years ago?
Okay, he overreached. He became like all people who get away with doing whatever they want. He's got a couple skeletons in his closet that are threatening to come back and haunt him. One of them, and one of them, and this is almost humorous, is that there's this scandal about this cherry blossom viewing party that they hold every year, in which important people in Japan are invited to come view the cherry blossoms with public funds. And the problem with that is that it appears Prime Minister Abe used those public funds to bring over his political constituents from Yamaguchi Prefecture, which is where his base is, and wine and dine them at a hotel, which is a violation of the election laws and probably a violation of the political funds laws. And the opposition party has been ruthless in pursuing that. I think there were 600 lawyers that have filed charges with the prosecutors about this cherry blossom viewing party with Abe, and it looks like it's a pretty clear violation of the law. So, in the background of all of this, in around February, the Abe cabinet, actually it was January 31st that they officially did it. The Abe cabinet decided to extend the retirement of a prosecutor named Kurokawa Hirofumu, I think. I forget his first name. Kurokawa Hirofumu.
Hiromu, I think.
Hiromu or Hirofumu?
Yeah.
Hiromu. Kurokawa.
Yeah.
Anyway, Kurokawa was the second most powerful prosecutor, or was the second most powerful prosecutor in Japan at the time. And there was a big problem with extending his retirement age. One is, what's the necessity of doing it? Prosecutors are supposed to retire at 63. And why do you do it a few days before his birthday? And another thing is that legally speaking, the prosecutors are under a different law, what is basically called the Public Prosecutor's Office Law, which determines when they can retire, which determines when they have to retire. And the reason the prosecutors have a separate law about them in the retirement and all those things is so that they can be spared from political influence. And by deciding that they could extend, when a prosecutor retires, they basically, have a sort of what in Japanese we call the candy and the whip. The candy being, okay, I can allow you to stay on as prosecutor, in which case you can rise to top prosecutor level. You get more money when you retire, and you get more prestige. And the whip being, well, if I don't like what you're doing, you're going to have to retire at 63. So the cabinet decided to do this, and they decided to do this without making any documents. It was all decided orally, right? Like, Abe cabinet got together, they had a cabinet decision, they extended the retirement age for Kurokawa without a single document, which is pretty typical of the Abe government, which has learned if you can't cover it up and you can't alter it, the best thing to do is to make sure that there's no documentation in the first place. Then you have nothing that you have to hide, which tremendously, amazingly, they managed to get away with. So this decision to fairly arbitrarily extend the retirement age for Kurokawa became a huge scandal. A scandal that you wouldn't think that the Japanese people would even be interested in, but people have gotten smarter. So they realized, okay, this is Prime Minister Abe basically trying to manipulate the prosecutor's office and stack the deck so that there's someone, the next person in power at the top will stifle any criminal investigations to him or his buddies. And while, insisting that their decision to essentially alter the law was legal, very sneakily in the middle of the coronavirus lockdown, Abe and his cronies put together a package of laws that were supposed to extend the retirement age of public servants. And in it, there was this condition that the cabinet could determine whether or not to extend the retirement age of the top prosecutors in the land if they felt like it. And there's no criteria for it. There's no clear articulation of what that necessity is and when would that necessity be. And it looked like, as Abe has done with every single unpopular law he's put in place, the what is the Peace Preservation Act, which was actually the law to allow Japan to go fight overseas, which was passed under the title of the Peace Preservation Act, or the State Secrets Act, or the Criminal Conspiracy Law, which was called an anti-terror law. Three very unpopular laws that resulted in a huge protest and huge opposition. The general public strongly opposed them, just like they opposed the casino laws. It looked like the prosecutor's law revision was going to sail through as well until I think on May 7th or so, a disgruntled, working woman basically, exclaimed that she was tired of seeing Prime Minister Abe change the law to benefit himself, and put out a tweet that said, Kensatsu Kensatsu ho kaisei hoan ni kogi shimasu. Like, I protest the changes in the prosecutor's laws. And that went viral on Twitter. And you had, millions of tweets about this thing. I think this controversy went on for a week. Then you got on a Friday, and it looked like they were going to ram it through the law on a Friday, and the opposition parties did something smart for a change. They put forth a no confidence bill on one of the people running the committee to oversee this bill, and then over the weekend, the outrage continued to build until, surprisingly, on a Monday, they actually pulled the bill for the time being. And after that, in some polls, Abe's support rates sunk as low as 26%, which is phenomenally low. That's so low, like you have to quit kind of low. And even though his support rates are, depending upon who's doing the polling, like if the Yomiuri or the Sankei is doing the polling, he still seems to, have 40% support rates. Overall, his support rates have really plummeted, and they plummeted because people think he's dishonest and he's abusing power. And with these kind of low ratings and, general dissatisfaction with things, it looks like it's going to be a tough time for him. But then again, the Japanese public has a short memory. So who knows, maybe in a month or so, people will be like, yeah, well, Abe's the least worst alternative.
Well, you see, actually, I would date the beginning of the end of the Abe administration a little bit differently. I think that the key issue is the split that developed between him and Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshida Suga, which means that basically the Abe team, which had been united for many years, has become disunited, and it appears to be over the issue of who will succeed Abe as prime minister. Abe apparently has decided that Fumio Kishida will be his successor, and Yoshida Suga didn't like that idea. And so based on this, there's now a dysfunction at the top. Essentially, Abe's team, his whole empire has broken into two. And that this is what's really at the root of him falling apart as prime minister right now. What's your reaction to that?
My reaction is that the rest of the world doesn't care. It's in the end, the Jiminto only cares about winning elections and having a majority in power. And Abe's sagging popularity ratings are the biggest Achilles heel that he has.
Okay. So
I mean, you're right that he and Suga are not getting along. But Abe, everyone in the LDP is also getting tired of Abe making these incredibly strategic blunders. The blunders including the tone deaf video of him and his dog telling people to stay home and enjoy their time at home, like during the lockdown, when without any concept that there are people that actually have to go out and work, right? Because Abe Shinzo is a spoiled brat. I used to call him Abe Bonbon on television, on Japanese television programs, until people told me that you had to at least call him Abe Sori. He's a spoiled brat who's the grandson of a war criminal, raised by his mother and his grandfather Kishi Nobusuke, who was one of Japan's most crooked politicians, who has this crazy dream of reinstating a imperial constitution and getting rid of the America's Constitution, and who has, sat at meetings where his former Minister of Justice said, Japan can't be a great country again until we get rid of basic human rights, popular sovereignty, and democracy itself. Mm-hmm. That is Shinzo Abe. I mean, his whole reason for being, and he said it many times, is to change Japan's constitution. Everything else is secondary. When he finally gets out of power, the fact that he hasn't changed the Constitution, which he wanted to do, will probably be a humiliating blow for him, because that's only been his only goal from the beginning. That's probably been his only goal because he seems to be possessed by the spirit of his grandfather.
Okay, well, our title is The End of Shinzo Abe. So,
Yep.
so let's, obviously now we're speculating about the future and nobody can be sure how it will go down. But what is your feeling about what kind of timeline are we looking at for this guy to remain as prime minister, and where do you think the coup de grace will come from?
Coup de grace can come in a couple of places. One is you have Kauai and the other former the former justice minister of is Kauai, and then you have Henri. When questions about Kauai bribing his way into power and other things come into play, and the prosecutors look like they're going to move on that, people will probably be questioning Abe's responsibility, naming that person a minister, and there'll be a push for him to resign to take responsibility. But the real sort of wild card, and I think that you're probably going to see this wild card put into place, is that Abe has been trying to push out Japan's top prosecutor right now. And Abe has been pushing for Inada to resign. And after he resigns, Inada's basically got no place to go, right? That's the end of the line for him. You can't go any higher. And Kudakawa is supposed to replace him. But now Kudakawa is gone. And Inada is facing all these accusations of being Abe's pet lapdog and being a failure as a prosecutor and not standing up to the powers that be. And when you're in that position where you got nothing left to lose, like what can he lose? He's on his last legs as a prosecutor. He's going to have to retire soon. And the prosecutor's office looks really bad. Everybody's sort of saying the prosecutors aren't doing their job, that they're just slaves to the powers that be. If Hinata decides to go after this cherry blossom viewing party thing and starts making waves, and it looks like he may actually raid the LDP headquarters or question Abe's criminal responsibility in this case, I think that you'll see everyone pressure Abe to resign. And usually how these things work is Hinata will say, yeah, we'll leak it out that they're really investigating these Sakura Mirukai, and then Abe will resign to take responsibility, and then that'll be the end of it. There'll be no prosecution, nothing will happen. But that, I think, is what's going to bring him down. Somebody's going to leak from the prosecutor's office that Inada and the prosecutors are really looking at the Sakura Mirukai, and then Abe is going to step down to avoid being prosecuted.
Okay, well, that's very specific and a bold prediction, I must say. And so it sounds like you think that Abe will not be serving out his current term until next September, that he'll be gone within the next few months?
I'd bet like, how much am I comfortable betting? Oh, well, I wouldn't bet, but I would play you a game of mahjong for money, because apparently that's okay, with stakes of about ichiman-en or niman-en a hand, on the fact that, yeah, he won't stake out his term.
Okay.
People are saying that he's going to resign in August. I think you'll have to really, really push and pull to get Abe to leave power, because he still has this dream of changing Japan's constitution. But I can't see any way that he holds on to his next term.
Okay, so that would mean that he's out at the latest by September 2021, and more likely sooner than that would be your prediction.
Yeah, I don't think he'll last a year.
Okay. Well, so before we go to the patron Q&A section, my final question in each interview generally tends to be, is there something that I didn't ask you about that I should have asked you about? Something that you'd like on the record for the YouTube video?
Yes, you should ask me, what do you think of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe?
What do you think of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe? As if we can't tell, but go ahead.
I think he is the most megalomaniacal, dishonest, destructive prime minister Japan has had in its history, and that Abenomics has done very little to benefit people, and that everyone who believed the claims of Abenomics and Womenomics was an idiot. And when he loses power and we look over at the wreckage that he's left behind, I hope they are ashamed of themselves.
Okay, so you really like Abe then?
I really like him. And I didn't even get into the talk about the great expose written about the time he allegedly paid off Yakuza to bury a political rival. We won't even go there because we don't have time.
Okay, yes, that is another story. I've actually, that's been reported by SNA as well at one point. All right, well, at this time, we will open it up to Q&A from our patrons who are